Welcome, everybody. WCG would like to start by thanking the 2024 to 2025 season sponsors. This includes University Products, Space Saver Interiors, Dorfman Museum Figures, Caring for Textiles, Click Netherfield, Gaylord Archival, Small Corp, Onteco Laser Solutions, and TrueView. Their donations enable WCG to provide networking events, educational programming, honoraria for speakers, and subsidized admission for members to attend historical venue tours. My name is Kiara Teeter, and I serve as president of the Washington Conservation Guild. On behalf of the WCG board, thank you all for joining us at tonight's program. I will pass it off to Linda Owen momentarily to introduce tonight's speaker, but before I do that, quick reminder about the 2025 Community Partnership Project at Naval Lodge number 4 is happening this Saturday, March 15th. Those of you who RSVP'd should have received more information by email. If you have questions about the CPP event, please contact Howard Wellman or outreach@washingtonconservationguild.org. WCG is looking for new board members for next season to help share responsibilities in running the organization. If you or someone you know would like to volunteer with us, please send us an email at nominating@washingtonconservationguild.org. We look forward to welcoming you. Our next member meeting is the Emerging Professional Lecture Series on Thursday, April 3rd, hosted in person at National Park Seminary Ballroom in Silver Spring, Maryland. Our DEAI committee will also moderate a virtual book club style event titled DEAI Reading Circle, Disability in Conservation on Thursday, April 17th. Announcements for both April programs will be released in the near future. WCG's annual end-of-year business meeting and raffle will be hosted in person on Thursday, May 1st in Baltimore. More details about that meeting are forthcoming. That's the end of tonight's announcements. And with that, I will hand things over to Linda. Take it away, Linda.
Thanks, Kira. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Elaina Gregg is the Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development at the American Flood Coalition. Prior to joining AFC, Elaina served as Emergency Programs Manager for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, where she oversaw the National Heritage Responders and Alliance for Responsive Initiative. Previously, Elaina served as Collections Care Specialist for Vizcaya Museum and Gardens in Miami, Florida. Elaina received an undergraduate degree in art history and Italian language from Ohio State University and a master's degree in disaster management from Florida International University. And I just wanted to note that for the discussion and Q&A after the talk this evening, we won't be recording it. And as we listen to the talk, please do feel free to drop your questions into the chat. And after the talk and during the discussion, you can also turn on your camera or not and unmute and ask your questions in person. So with that, I will turn it over to Elaina. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. All right, let me share my screen. But thank you so much for joining today. As Linda said, I'm Elaina Gregg, and today I'm going to be discussing the state of water emergencies in 2025, and then share some tips for increasing your preparedness at either your site, your institution, both, and to prepare your collections. So as Linda mentioned, just to put this in context a little bit more, I started my career at Vizcaya in Miami, Florida. Vizcaya is an historic house museum. It's located right off of Biscayne Bay. I was in the Conservation and Collections Care Department, and so was tasked with thinking about and implementing measures to protect both the site and its contents. And in September 2017, Hurricane Irma arrived in South Florida, which caused quite extensive damage to both Vizcaya and the region at large. We had a strong preparedness plan in place at the time, but we really hadn't capitalized on preparing for response and recovery activities. And that really impacted how response and recovery went. So experiencing the professional and personal toll that Irma took on me, I decided to pursue a master's degree in disaster management from FIU in 2018. In 2020, I joined FAIC as their emergency programs manager and oversaw the National Heritage Responders and Alliance for Response programs, which I'll discuss a little bit more later in the presentation. And then most recently, I joined the American Flood Coalition as their Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development. I'll also just take a minute to note that what I'm presenting today is not on behalf of my employer and represents solely my professional insights. Okay, so let's get into it. According to the National Risk Index, there are 18 natural hazards listed on this slide. And I will note that I intentionally am using the word natural here just to distinguish between environmental and human-made hazards. So for example, coastal and riverine flooding are considered natural hazards, while flooding due to a dam failure is considered a human-made hazard. Human-made hazards are not included in the National Risk Index, so they are not listed here. I'll also mention that these hazards can also cause secondary hazards. So for example, drought can increase your risk for wildfires. Wildfires can then lead to landslides. So there's a whole second part of this that involves compounding hazards and compounding disasters thereafter. But just to lay out the whole universe of what currently is impacting our system. I'll also note that there is just to distinguish between the verbiage, hazards versus disasters. A hazard is the threat of an event that will likely have a negative impact, and hazards only become disasters when they significantly impact communities negatively. So for example, a wildfire in a region that's not impacting a community or doesn't have negative impacts on a community is not necessarily considered a disaster. But when communities are impacted, then that escalates from a hazard to a disaster. I'm sure many of you have seen iterations of this graphic over the past few years. This is created by NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And it really is intended to showcase how many billion-dollar disasters we're experiencing from year to year. So this is the graphic from 2024. And as you can see, there were $28 billion climate disasters last year. And for reference, this is the graphic from 2022, where you can see $18 billion climate disasters. So the number of events increased from 18 to 28 in just 2 years. For further context, before 2020, the record for billion-dollar events was 16, and that was a tie between 2011 and 2017. So we are seeing more billion-dollar disasters, more activity, stronger storms. And one thing that's become increasingly clear is that we need to expect the unexpected, and what we have known before doesn't necessarily apply to how things are playing out current day. Just to provide a few examples of how we've seen that play out. Here's an image from Breathitt County, Kentucky in July 2022. From July 25th to 30th, 2022, there was between 14 and 16 inches of rainfall. And for context, there is less than a 1 in 1,000th chance of this much rainfall over 5 days in any given year. In Whitesburg, Kentucky, the North Fork of the Kentucky River swelled to 21 inches. And prior to 2022, the highest it had ever swollen to was 14 inches in 1957. So not only was there flooding from excessive rainfall, but there was also flooding from the river. So they were impacted really on two fronts. This was exceedingly rare for Kentucky, for this part of Kentucky rather. And many homeowners did not have flood insurance. Many cultural institutions did not have sufficient preparedness in place because this hadn't been something that they had dealt with in the past. So the level of damage was quite extensive. Here's an image from Asheville from October 2024. I'm sure you all are familiar with Hurricane Helene's impact in Western North Carolina. But before Hurricane Helene, Asheville was considered pretty safe from climate disasters, with the last major flooding event in Western North Carolina taking place in 1916. And part of the challenge with Helene was the precursor rain event that came days before Helene's arrival. The rainfall from the precursor rain really saturated the ground. And so where typically the ground would have absorbed some of the rainfall from a storm, the strength of Helene, it was already inundated with water and unable to continue to take on absorption, hence the increase in flooding. So some quick facts about flooding, and I have found these in the past to be helpful to kind of make the case, especially to if you have leadership that needs to be convinced why it's important to invest in preparedness procedures, in readying staff and stacking supplies. These are really staggering figures and quite compelling to make that argument. But 99% of US counties have been impacted by flooding since the 90s, which is, quite severe. Flooding accounts for 40% of all disasters worldwide, causing approximately half of disaster-related deaths. There are $2.4 billion in flood losses annually, and this figure is at least 1 year out of date, so I imagine that is higher at this point. This is a big one. Just 1 inch of floodwater can cause $25,000 in damage to your average size home. And homeowners and renters insurance typically does not cover flooding. And people outside of high-risk areas file about 40% of National Flood Insurance Program claims. So it's not just the areas that we typically think are prone to flooding, it's many, many other areas as well. So what do we do with this information and how do we prepare ourselves? I like to think of when thinking about starting to get your preparedness up to date and ready to go. There are 3 big things to get started. First, supplies. The second, knowing your roles. And the third, practicing and making sure that there's some institutional muscle memory. Supplies are a key component to an efficient and effective response. There are many guides on items to include in your emergency supply kits, but I just want to point out a few of my favorites. Also, I kept these slides, just a general note, I kept my slides very clean to avoid filling them with text, but I'm happy to send links or further context after the presentation if anybody has trouble finding these websites or, figuring out where to go to find this information. So Gregg Collections Care, this is Becca Kennedy's company. She has excellent resources for all aspects of emergency preparedness, but I especially love her emergency kit resources. She has both a list of supplies to include in your emergency kit and a kind of like decision tree on whether you should go for an emergency kit or an emergency supply cache, and is very thoughtful about how to consider those questions and decisions. Connecting to Collections Care, this is administered by the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. They hosted a webinar a few years back on emergency kits that is super helpful and very relevant still. Just generally, if you want to have supplies to help with documentation, salvage, cleaning, drying, and safety. So first, you want to think through the hazards that are inherent to your site. So if your site is located near a body of water, for example, and is at risk of flooding or has, increased storm activity, you want to be sure to have drying materials readily available. And above all, you need supplies to protect yourself and your fellow staff members. So this is protecting your airways, so respiratory protection, supplies to protect your clothing, which could be Tyvek suits, safety goggles. You might want to cover your feet and your shoes, your footwear. But again, there are so many guides out there of like basically how to build up a first iteration of a supply cache and then how to maintain it over time. Looking toward assigning roles, here's one of my favorite resources. In my former role at FAIC, everyone would agree that David Carmichael is one of my professional heroes. And his books I really, really appreciate and highly recommend. But generally, just to give him an overview of the incident command system and how it is helpful in disaster and emergency scenarios. The incident command system is a system employed by most local, state, and federal emergency management agencies. It's a way to assign roles in an emergency situation to ensure that people know what they're responsible for and who they're reporting to. In its most standard form, there's the graphic on the right of the slide. You have the incident command, that's the leader of the incident. As part of the command team, there's the safety officer, the public information officer, and the liaison officer. So the person charged with keeping people safe, the person in charge of liaising with other entities that are responding, and the public information officer is the communications person. So the person responsible with making sure messages are getting out to media and other entities that need to be informed. Then there's the 4 key components that are planning, logistics, finance, and operations. So this is intended to swell and compress as needed. So it can be applied to a team of 1. It can just be an incident commander, or it can be swollen up to a group of 200. It really is intended to be able to like branch and expand as needed, which is the beauty of using this system. And in his book, David Carmichael kind of breaks down how to apply this to a cultural institution and how to kind of bridge the gaps between language used with emergency management and language that's more familiar to cultural heritage professionals. And then there's practice. This is another book of David Carmichael's that I really love. It is focused on tabletop exercises. Tabletops are discussion-based scenarios where you kind of sit down with a key group of people that are responsible for navigating a disaster scenario, and you talk through the hypothetical scenario. And it's really an easy and cost-effective way to increase your staff preparedness. For example, if your site is located where there's active earthquake, there's a lot of earthquake activity, you might have an earthquake-based scenario, and in a calm setting, you talk through like what resources do we need to bring in, who do we need to be in contact with, what's our insurance policy, do we have that updated somewhere, where is that kept, just basic questions so that, and it's a calm environment, so you're clear-headed and can actually think through these things without adrenaline rushing through. And it is a super helpful way to identify gaps in your plan, and then to address them before something happens. Other options for practicing with colleagues include walkthroughs. So this could just be a walkthrough with staff. You could also include local responders. I know at Vizcaya, we used to do walkthroughs with law enforcement and the fire department just to make sure they were familiar with all of our exits. I find many historic house museums and historic sites have atypical exit ways sometimes, and it's important for responders to know that they exist and where they are. And then there's also full-scale exercises, which are definitely the most demanding when it comes to time and resources, but that would be practicing a full disaster scenario. So setting up kind of like the aftermath, practicing evacuating collections, practicing drying. It's a very involved process, but it is super helpful if you're able to dedicate the time and resources to that at your site. I'm surely biased because I love FAIC and worked for them for 4.5 years, but I find their resources to be super helpful. The Emergency Response and Salvage app, this was created based on the emergency response and salvage wheel, which is pictured at the lower right corner of the slide. And the app is downloadable. It's free. It provides a step-by-step guide for different types of emergencies and different types of mediums. There's also a way to get in touch with the National Heritage Responders from the app. And you can also email from the app, which is very helpful. Then there's the National Heritage Responders. They are a volunteer corps. I know there's several NHR volunteers on the call tonight, but they are trained to assist institutions before, during, and after disasters. There is a hotline that I will put in the chat momentarily, but it's 202-661-8068. And that will, there's a volunteer staffing the hotline 24/7. So to get, quick advice from someone who is very much knowledgeable in the subject matter, that's a great way to go. They also are reachable by email. And then there's the Alliance for Response Initiative. This is a local network-based program. So the intention is really to bring local emergency management and cultural heritage professionals together at the local level. I think there are currently about 37 networks around the country, but they, each AFR has different priorities and initiatives they're working on, and it's a great way to get connected to people in your community. I know that in South Florida, when I was there, this guy was part of the South Florida Alliance for Response, and we actually figured out a way to get a seat in the local emergency operations center through Miami-Dade County, and we were able to, in disaster settings, so during hurricanes, during the Super Bowl, during other big events, someone from our AFR could go to the EOC and was able to connect with all the cultural institutions in the region that were part of our AFR. So it is a great way to get connected and a great way to get access to resources that your neighbors are working on. And then Mayday Prep. So Mayday is an initiative that's also administered by FAIC, and it's really just a campaign to get folks to think about doing an activity or two in the month of May to prepare your institution. So it could be, we are going to do a tabletop exercise, or we're going to do an audit of our supplies and see what we need to replace. So just generally, walking through what is available to you and how to proceed as an institution. I'll also mention that the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative has a ton of emergency resources on their website. I highly recommend checking them out. They're great and are definitely updated as well. And the Emergency Committee through the American Institute for Conservation, they have a Zotero full of resources as well that are very helpful. So a few professional development opportunities that are available to folks interested in building up their own skills in this arena. Two that I'm most familiar with are the Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HEART. This is administered by the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and FEMA's Heritage Emergency National Task Force. It takes place every December and is about a week long. I think it's 5 days long, and they really go through everything from practicing evacuating collections to practicing talking to the media. It's super comprehensive, very helpful. It takes place in DC. And I think applications open in October or so. But that's great, and it's yearly, so it's a known entity. And then FAIC, they provide trainings through the Alliance for Response program. These are specific to certain regions, and I think they do about 2 trainings per year on average. So their website will have the regions that they're working with that given year. If you happen to be in one of those regions, definitely reach out to them to get, incorporated into their trainings. Their trainings are a hybrid model where there's several months of online curriculum materials and then a 2-day in-person training. And those are really intended to build up regional capacity. So it's, you working with other people that live in your region, and making sure you know how to get in touch with each other when something happens. And then there's also the CERT program. I'm a big fan of this as well. This is the Community Emergency Response Team training. This is a community-based program that's offered locally. There are CERT programs offered in all 50 states, and I think there's over 3,200 local programs. So there's likely something available wherever you live. And this program really focuses on fire safety, light search and rescue, team organization, and disaster medical operations, which might seem abstract from the reality of like it's not touching on cultural heritage. But when I was working at Vizcaya, we hosted a CERT program. It's free to all participants, and it's free to host it as well. They will come to your site and host the whole training for free, and you get supplies as well. They came on site, and we had, of the 50 people in the training, there were about 15 staff people from Vizcaya, and it was super helpful to see how disaster operations go through the emergency management lens. So to think about how people that are going to be responding to an event are coming on site, the things that they're thinking about, their prioritization, how they're navigating through a disaster is very helpful. And also they have a whole triage system where they color code according to severity, which I think a lot of institutions have kind of translated that to collections-based triage as well. So it is very helpful to make the connection there.
Thank you, Elaina. That was great.